Your Majesty, why did you order all of this food? I told you I was bringing you back something to eat. Look, I got you some steamed broccoli from Kenny Rogers Roasters.
Ugh, vile weed!
All right, if you don't like that, I also got you a muffin. You know, a muffin can be very filling. I also got you a big salad.
A big salad?
It's like a regular salad, only bigger, with lots of stuff in it. Oh, and I got you some frozen yogurt. And the best part is it's 100% fat-free. So, what would you like?
All of it, plus what I ordered.
You've got to be kidding me. And you're already eating that gigantic platter of shrimp? Hold on while I put this down over there. So what's all this stuff in here anyway? Beefarino? You've got a block of cheese in here the size of a car battery. A 4-pound can of tuna. This isn't for a person. This is for Biosphere 3. Ugh. Movie hot dogs? I'd rather lick the food off the floor. Why didn't you get a Papaya King hot dog? Oh. You did. Macadamia nuts? These things are like 80 cents a nut. Hold on, I gotta move this out of here. So what do you have in here? Double Crunch cereal? Black and white cookies? Cinnamon babka? Why didn't you get chocolate? Oh. Never mind. What are these? Pudding skin singles? A pair of bear claws from Monk's? A marble rye from Schnitzer's. Swordfish from Mendy's.
Best swordfish in the city. The best.
Pasta Primavera from Pfeiffer's. And a bottle of Hennigan's. An eggplant calzone from Paisano's. Oh. And Mackinac peaches from Joe's. Aren't these the ones that are only ripe for 2 weeks out of the year? What's this note? Hey, Romeo, take your business elsewhere. I'm banned?
You're banned.
Dave is getting upset. Hold on. I gotta move some of this stuff out of the way. Oh, and I see you got some Chinese food too. What is all of this? Chow Fung? Pea pods with extra MSG. Kung Pao? I see Your Majesty likes his chicken spicy. Supreme flounder from Hop Sings? How did you do that? I'm not even in the delivery area. Oh no, not another note. Dave Romeo, now you're on our list? You got me blacklisted from Hop Sings? How do they even know who I am?
I named names.
Hoochie Mama! What, are you out of your mind? How could you eat like this? Look at you, you're disgusting, you're bald, you're paunchy, all kinds of sounds are emanating from your body 24 hours a day?
I'm not ashamed of my body.
Exactly. That's your problem. You should be. You're lucky to have anybody. If there's a woman who could take your presence for more than 10 consecutive seconds, you should hang on to her like grim death, which is not far off, by the way.
Pass me that cocktail sauce.
Here. Hey, Your Majesty. The ocean called. They're running out of shrimp.
Do you realize that I could have your head?
You know, for a big fat guy, you're not very jolly. All right, hold on. I'm going to get all this out of the way, and then we can start your coaching session. Look, Your Majesty, you've really put yourself into a very difficult situation. You know what I mean. First of all, everyone knows that you're trying to put the moves on Anne Boleyn. But it's just the two of us talking man to man right now, and as you can see, there's nobody else in sight. How could you do this to Catherine of Aragon? There's nobody else anywhere in the world who would dream of asking the Pope to grant a dispensation to divorce her after you were the one who asked the Pope for a dispensation to marry her in the first place. And I'm feeling that it's good for you to finally have someone just holding you accountable, because you're in a tight spot. And don't try any of your ridiculous rationalizations on me, because I won't hear it. La 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 la. La 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 la. La 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 la. La 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 la. La 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 la. Are you finished? Good. So listen very carefully to what I have to say to you. This is a very delicate matter, and I don't want to say it very loudly. Lean in. Closer now, and you will see what I mean about the importance of discretion. Your Majesty, even if you are the king, you need to understand that this isn't a dream. You're not going to wake up and find that everything is okay with what you've been doing, because it isn't. The only sound that you will hear is the outrage of your subjects about the way you've treated your beloved queen. So I'll whisper in your ear. I urge you to immediately put an end once and for all to this insane talk about removing your queen, and order your nobles to silence any more talk about this until there's a kind of hush all over the world tonight. I know what you're thinking. Why did I pick this Herman song for this episode? Do you have any idea how hard it is to find a song about Henry VIII? Except...
I, Henry VIII, I am. Henry VIII, I am. I got married to the widow next door. She's been married 7 times before, and everyone was Henry. And Willie Arthur. No, sir, him and eighth, man of Henry. Henry VIII, I am. Henry VIII, I am.
Man, that Patrick Swayze, what a singer. Sure, I thought about using that one, but the lyrics just didn't go with the subject matter. I even thought maybe I could find something usable in the second verse, but, well, you know. In the 1981 Alan Alda film The Four Seasons, 3 couples go on quarterly vacations together, but their friendship and loyalties are divided and suffer much tension when one of the husbands divorces his wife in order to pursue a younger and more exciting woman. In Henry VIII, the king decides to divorce his wife of more than 20 years after he is captivated by one of the queen's beautiful young maids of honor, thus creating tension and dividing loyalties amongst his followers. So let's take a look at the plot. The play opens with a prologue by an unidentified figure who stresses that the audience will see a serious play and prepares the audience not to like everything they hear. Act 1 begins with a conversation among the Dukes of Norfolk and Buckingham and Lord Abergavenny. They express their mutual resentment towards the ruthless power and arrogant pride of Cardinal Wolsey. At that moment, Wolsey passes by with his attendants and expresses his own hostility towards Buckingham. Not long after that, Buckingham is arrested on treason charges as a result of a plot by Wolsey to get rid of him. In Scene 2, King Henry VIII demonstrates his favoritism towards Cardinal Wolsey. Queen Catherine enters the court and petitions the king about Wolsey's abuse of the tax system for his own purposes. Wolsey defends himself, but when the king revokes the cardinal's measures, Wolsey pivots and tells Cromwell to spread a rumor that it was Wolsey himself who was responsible for the king's action. Catherine also pleads for Buckingham, but Wolsey defends the arrest and produces the Duke's surveyor as the primary accuser. After hearing the surveyor, the king orders Buckingham's trial for treason. Wolsey throws a banquet in his home where the king and his attendants enter in disguise as maskers. The king sees and dances with Anne Boleyn and is instantly attracted to her. In Act 2, two anonymous gentlemen are discussing Buckingham's treason trial in which he was found guilty and ordered to be executed. Just then, Buckingham is led away in custody, but is permitted to make his final farewells to his followers and the public. After he leaves, the gentlemen discuss court gossip, particularly a potential split between the king and queen, and Wolsey's hostility towards Catherine. Now Wolsey starts to move against the queen, but the nobles Norfolk and Suffolk observe him with resentment. Wolsey introduces Cardinal Campeius and Gardiner to the king. Campeius has come to serve as a judge in a trial that Wolsey is arranging for Catherine. Anne Boleyn discusses the queen's situation with an old lady who is her attendant and expresses her sympathy at the queen's troubles. But just then, the Lord Chamberlain enters and informs her that the king has made her Marchioness of Pembroke. Once the Lord Chamberlain leaves, the old lady teases Anne about her sudden advancement in the king's favor. In Act 2, Scene 4, there's a very formal yet staged trial in which Catherine pleads her case before the king and his courtiers. She reproaches Wolsey for his conspiring against her and refuses to stay for the proceedings. However, the king defends Wolsey and says that it was his own doubts about the legitimacy of their marriage that led to the trial. Cardinal Campeius states that the hearing cannot continue in the queen's absence, and the king agrees to adjourn the proceedings. In Act 3, Cardinals Wolsey and Campeius visit Catherine among her ladies-in-waiting, where Catherine makes sure they know that she doesn't trust either of them. However, she eventually relents and gives in to their wishes. In Act 3, Scene 2, we see Norfolk, Suffolk, Surrey, and the Lord Chamberlain plotting against Cardinal Wolsey. In one of the worst strokes of bad luck imaginable, a packet of Wolsey's letters to the Pope is redirected to the king. These letters show that Wolsey is playing two sides against the middle. He tells the Pope that he opposes Henry's plans to divorce Catherine, while telling the king that he supports it. Henry is furious with Wolsey and shows him the misdirected letters. Wolsey realizes that he's lost Henry's favor, and his enemies, the noblemen, mock him in his misery. After he's lost everything, the cardinal sends his follower Cromwell away so that Cromwell is not brought down with him in his fall from grace. The same two anonymous gentlemen return in Act 4 and observe and comment on the lavish procession for Anne Boleyn's coronation as queen. They also lavish praise on her and say that they understand why the king fell in love with her. A third gentleman joins them and says that Thomas Cromwell has risen in favor and that there are plots against Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury. In Scene 2, Catherine, who's very ill and close to death, is told the details of Wolsey's death. She also has a very pleasant vision of heavenly dancing spirits. A loyal subject named Caputius visits Catherine, and she expresses her continuing loyalty to the king, and despite the divorce, wishes the new queen well. Soon after Caputius leaves, the queen dies peacefully in her bed. In Act 5, the king learns that the new queen, Anne, has delivered a baby girl, and even though he was hoping for a boy, he seems genuinely happy at the news. Henry has Cranmer visit him and expresses his friendship. The king also knows that some of his nobles are plotting against Cranmer, and so he gives him his own ring in case they act maliciously towards him. As it turns out, some of the nobles concoct a carefully hatched plot accusing Cranmer of heresy, but just as he's about to be taken to the Tower as a prisoner, Cranmer shows his attackers the king's ring. Just then, the king comes in and declares Cranmer to be a good man, and the plot is dissolved. In the final scene, and at the request of the king, Cranmer baptizes the future Queen Elizabeth I, and Henry asks Cranmer to be the godfather to his daughter. Cranmer prophesies about the glories of the newborn princess's future reign, calling for 1,000 blessings. The king joyfully says, O Lord Archbishop, thou hast made me now a man, and declares the day to be a holiday. The epilogue acknowledges that the play is unlikely to please everyone, but asks nonetheless for the audience's approval. When we return, we'll look at some of the remarkable characters in Henry VIII. I was really surprised to see just how many characters are contained in this play, but we're only going to look at a few of the more prominent ones and their motivations. Let's start with the king himself. Henry VIII has been married to his wife Catherine of Aragon for more than 20 years. However, in that time, she has not been able to provide him with a male heir. It's unclear which of the king's motivations is greater, his concern about not having an heir to the throne, or his voracious sexual appetite, which was not limited to his queen. Nevertheless, things get far more complicated once he lays eyes on his wife's maid of honor, Anne Boleyn. The king had already had an affair with Anne's older sister Mary, but now he turned his sights on Anne. The problem was he was still married to Catherine, who was a magnificently chaste, loyal, and virtuous wife to the king. Henry VIII was a staunch Catholic and could not get a papal clemency to divorce Catherine, especially after he had to get a special dispensation to marry her in the first place because she had previously been married to his older brother Arthur. However, their marriage by proxy had not been consummated, as Arthur was not yet 16 years old at the time that he died. Cardinal Wolsey is the Lord High Chancellor of England and Henry VIII's most trusted advisor. In his role, he wielded enormous power, which he used to amass an enormous wealth of lands and gold and punish his enemies or anyone who stood in his way. His ambition to become pope and his accumulation of wealth eventually caught up with him when the king learned that Wolsey had been pretending to help him get an annulment from Rome, but was actually making his own deal to have Henry marry the French king's sister, the Duchess of Alençon, a deal that would have no doubt further lined Cardinal Wolsey's pockets. And finally, there's the very interesting Duke of Buckingham, who Cardinal Wolsey has falsely arrested as a traitor. In Act 2, Scene 1, we learn that he's the son of the Duke of Buckingham, whom Richard III had executed in that play. As he's led away to execution, he recounts to his jailers, "My noble father, Henry of Buckingham, who first raised head against usurping Richard, flying for succor to his servant Bannister, being distressed, was by that wretch betrayed, and without trial fell. God's peace be with him. Henry VII succeeding, truly pitying my father's loss, like a most royal prince restored me to my honors, and out of ruins made my name once more noble. Now his son, Henry VIII, life, honor, name, and all that made me happy at one stroke has taken forever from the world. I had my trial, and must needs say a noble one, which makes me a little happier than my wretched father. Yet thus far we are one in fortunes. Both fell by our servants, by those men we loved most, a most unnatural and faithless service." When we return, we'll look at some of the plot devices and memorable scenes from Henry VIII. There aren't that many plot devices to speak of in this play. Perhaps the most notable one is misdirected letters. Cardinal Wolsey includes a list of his wealth and a letter to the Pope explaining why he objects to the king marrying Anne Boleyn, which leads to his demise when the king discovers it. We also saw Friar Lawrence's misdirected letter to Romeo in Romeo and Juliet, King Claudius's misdirected letters to the King of England in Hamlet, misdirected letters of Barone and Don Armado in Love's Labour's Lost, and an intercepted letter of Merle's in Richard II. There's also a few prophecies in this play. Cardinal Wolsey accurately prophesies the hour and day of his death, and Thomas Cranmer prophesies that Queen Elizabeth I will live a long life as a monarch and die an unmarried virgin. There's also a lot of infighting among the nobles in this play. In fact, the king interrupts his council, trying to railroad Thomas Cranmer out of his position and have him sent to the Tower. When the king comes in, he admonishes all of them and insists that they love Cranmer, their enemy. This is not unlike Edward IV's request of his warring nobles just before his death in Richard III. Say what you want about this play, but what it lacks in empathy for the title character, it makes up for in memorable scenes and magnificent dialogue from start to finish. But let's just take a look at 3 of the best scenes. First, in Act 2, Scene 1, after the Duke of Buckingham has been sentenced to execution, a group of loyal followers and friends gather in sympathy, support, and prayer for him, and he gratefully addresses them. All good people, you that thus far have come to pity me, hear what I say, and then go home and lose me. I have this day received a traitor's judgment, and by that name must die. Yet heaven bear witness, and if I have a conscience, let it sink me, even as the axe falls, if I be not faithful. The law I bear no malice for my death, it has done upon the premises but justice. But those that sought it, I could wish more Christians. Be what they will, I heartily forgive 'em. Yet let 'em look they glory not in mischief, nor build their evils on the graves of great men, for then my guiltless blood must cry against 'em. For further life in this world I ne'er hope, nor will I sue, although the king have mercies more than I dare make faults. You few that love me, and dare be bold to weep for Buckingham, his noble friends and fellows, whom to leave is only bitter to him, only dying go with me, like good angels to my end. And as the long divorce of steel falls on me, make of your prayers one sweet sacrifice, and lift my soul to heaven. Lead on God's name. The next scene is Act 2, Scene 4, when Queen Catherine is brought on trial and accused of infidelity. Her courage, dignity, and grace under fire are similar to the speeches of Hermione and Paulina in The Winter's Tale. And finally, Cardinal Wolsey's fall from grace in Act 3, Scene 2, when he realizes that there will be no coming back from his disgrace, contains some of the most beautiful language in the entire play. When we return, we'll look at some of the major themes running through Henry VIII. There are 3 major falls from grace that mark Henry VIII. The first fall from grace is that of the Duke of Buckingham, who, like his father, is beheaded as a traitor by the king. However, this duke was not a traitor, and the charges were trumped up by Cardinal Wolsey, who bribed Buckingham's surveyor with gold to lie about the duke to the king, and he's dispatched early in the play. The second fall is the Queen's, Catherine of Aragon. We know that she falls for 3 reasons. First, in 20 years of marriage, she's not been able to give the king a male heir. Second, the king falls in love with Anne Boleyn, who is the Queen's maid of honor. And third, Henry says that she may have been unfaithful to him and wants a divorce or an annulment from Rome. Since Rome will not agree to this, the king employs Cardinal Wolsey and later Thomas Cranmer to legitimize his divorce. And while this was devastating news for Catherine, it was even worse news for the Catholic faith in England. And the third fall from grace belongs to Cardinal Wolsey, who was once the closest person to Henry VIII, but is hoist on his own petard, first because he's double-dealing with the king and the pope in order to get himself the papacy, and second because he's amassed an enormous fortune of lands, riches, and furnishings. What's worse is that he accidentally includes incriminating letters in a packet to the king, who takes away everything he owns. But Cardinal Wolsey and Catherine of Aragon died of natural causes, both probably accelerated by great sadness and depression. There's also an attempt to take down Thomas Cranmer. However, the king intervenes and the plot is prevented. Cranmer also ascends to the position of Archbishop of Canterbury and manages to stay in the king's favor. Stephen Gardiner ascends to the position of Bishop of Winchester through the assistance of Cardinal Wolsey, but comes dangerously close to losing his head after he leads the council in false accusations against Thomas Cranmer. In addition, Anne Boleyn, Thomas Cromwell, and the unseen Sir Thomas More all ascend. However, inevitably, all three of them fall, the first for infidelity, the second as a traitor, and the third as a martyr, and truly a man for all seasons. It's a foregone conclusion that if you lived in England under the reign of Henry VIII, you lived in constant fear of angering the king and potentially losing your own head. As we saw with the Duke of Buckingham and Catherine of Aragon, innocence does not prevent you from falling out of grace. Self-preservation was a fact of life. However, it didn't stop many from pursuing their own ambitions. Cardinal Wolsey was tempted by financial wealth and also had a healthy appetite for lechery. Stephen Gardiner, like Wolsey, craved ambition and power, and it almost cost him very dearly. Although his part in the play is relatively small, Thomas Cromwell also walked a tightrope with the king and eventually loses his own head. The Duke of Norfolk, Lord Abergavenny, and the Earl of Surrey are driven by revenge against Cardinal Wolsey for making up false accusations of treason against the Duke of Buckingham, the father-in-law of the latter two. When we return, we'll look at some of the most powerful lines in Henry VIII. While this may be the most questionable of all of Shakespeare's history plays, there's no denying that its true merit lies in the power of its magnificent speeches. In Act 2, Scene 4, Queen Catherine delivers perhaps the most glorious lines in the entire play as she pleads her case to the king in front of the full court and defies Cardinal Wolsey to his face. My lord, I am a simple woman, much too weak to oppose your cunning. Your meek and humble mouth, you sign your place and calling in full seeming with meekness and humility. But your heart is crammed with arrogancy, spleen, and pride. You have, by fortune and his highness's favor, gone slightly o'er low steps, and now are mounted where powers are your retainers, and your words, domestics to you, serve your will, as it please yourself, pronounce their office. I must tell you, you tender more your person's honor than your high profession spiritual. That again, I do refuse you for my judge, and here before you all appeal unto the Pope to bring my whole cause for his holiness, and to be judged by him. Also in Act 2, Scene 4, as Catherine is leaving, the king gives his most notable lines of the entire play, in which he acknowledges, at least to himself, how virtuous and remarkable a woman he married. He says, "Go thy ways, Kate. That man in the world who shall report he has a better wife, let him in not be trusted for speaking false in that. Thou art alone, if thy rare qualities, sweet gentleness, thy meekness saint-like, wife-like government, obeying and commanding thy parts sovereign, and pious else could speak thee out, the queen of earthly queens. She's noble born, and like her true nobility, she carries herself towards me." In Act 3, Scene 2, Cardinal Wolsey gives some valuable advice to Cromwell, not unlike the fatherly advice Polonius gives to his son Laertes in Act 1, Scene 2 of Hamlet. "Cromwell, I did not think to shed a tear in all my miseries, but thou hast forced me out of thy honest truth to play the woman." Let us dry our eyes, and thus far hear me, Cromwell, and when I am forgotten, as I shall be, and sleep in dull, cold marble, where no mention of me more must be heard of, say, I taught thee. Say, Wolsey, that once trod the ways of glory, and sounded all the depths and shoals of honor, found thee a way out of his wreck to rise in, a sure and safe one, though thy master missed it. Mark but my fall, and that ruined me. Cromwell, I charge thee, fling away ambition, By that sin fell the angels. How can man then, the image of his Maker, hope to win by it? Love thyself last. Cherish those hearts that hate thee. Corruption wins not more than honesty. Still, in thy right hand carry gentle peace to silence envious tongues. Be just and fear not. Let all the ends thou aimest at be thy country's, thy God's, and truth's. Then, if thou fallest, O Cromwell, thou fallest a blessed martyr. Serve the king, and prithee lead me in. There take an inventory of all I have, to the last penny, 'tis the king's. My robe and my integrity to heaven is all I dare now call mine own. O Cromwell, Cromwell, had I but served my God with half the zeal I serve my king, he would not in mine age have left me naked to mine enemies. In Act 4, Scene 2, Lady Catherine on her deathbed gives instructions to the Emperor's good ambassador Caputius to deliver to her now ex-husband Henry VIII. Catherine says, I have commended to his goodness the model of our chaste loves, his young daughter. The dews of heaven fall thick in blessings on her, beseeching him to give her virtuous breeding. She is young and of a noble, modest nature. I hope she will deserve well, and a little to love her for her mother's sake that loved him, heaven knows how dearly. My next poor petition is that his noble grace would have some pity upon my wretched women, that so long have followed both my fortunes faithfully, of which there is not one I dare avow, and now I should not lie, but will deserve for virtue and true beauty of the soul, for honesty and decent carriage, a right good husband. Let him be a noble, and sure those men are happy that shall have him. The last is for my men. They are the poorest, but poverty could never draw 'em from me, that they may have their wages duly paid 'em, and something over to remember me by. If heaven had pleased to have given me longer life and able means, we had not parted thus. These are the whole contents, and good my lord, by that you love the dearest in the world, as you wish Christian peace to souls departed, stand these poor people's friend, and urge the king to do me this last right. Between the courage she demonstrated in her earlier speeches when on trial and the charity she pours forth in this speech, Shakespeare has truly portrayed her as one of the most noble, admirable, and virtuous characters in his entire collection. I want to briefly mention something that Cranmar says in Act 5, Scene 5, when he's baptizing Elizabeth I. Let me speak, sir, for heaven now bids me, and the words I utter let none think flattery, for they'll find 'em truth. This royal infant heaven still move about her, though in her cradle, yet now promises upon this land 1,000,000 blessings, which time shall bring to ripeness. She shall be, but few now living can behold that goodness. Well, this is one of the few prophecies in any Shakespeare play that doesn't come true, as we'll explore in the interesting facts section of this video. And let's finish up with some short but valuable lessons. In Act 3, Scene 1, when Cardinals Wolsey and Pompeius pay a visit to Lady Catherine in her despair, she says to Griffith, "Now I think on it, they should be good men, their affairs as righteous, but all hoods make not monks." In other words, you must be congruent in your words, your appearance, and your actions. And finally, in Act 4, Scene 2, after Wolsey has died, we hear Griffith offer some charity to him, saying to Lady Catherine, "Noble madam, men's evil manners live in brass. Their virtues we write in water." In other words, people will remember our failings long after they've forgotten our good qualities. When we return, we'll look at some of the major turning points in Henry VIII, as well as correlations to some of the other Shakespeare plays. The first major turning point in this play is in Act 1, Scene 4, when the king views Anne Boleyn at Cardinal Wolsey's home during the Mask. And even though he speaks less than 10 lines to her in the entire play, and she speaks 0 to him directly, from that moment on, Henry VIII is bound and determined to get rid of his wife Catherine, who has not delivered any male heirs, and to fix his sights on Anne Boleyn. Still, he can't help but wonder, what would have happened had Catherine been in the room with her husband when he first saw Anne Boleyn? Perhaps he wouldn't have had the opportunity to focus all of his attentions on her so openly, and things might have turned out quite differently. Oh well, I guess we'll never know. The second major turning point takes place in Act 3, Scene 1, when after their relentless efforts, Cardinal Wolsey and Cardinal Campeius finally wear down Queen Catherine and get her to give in and allow them to represent her interests against the king's in his trial to get an annulment from her. As she intuitively suspected, they just want to get her out of the way, and that clears the path for the king to marry Anne Boleyn. And finally, the downfall of proud Cardinal Wolsey in Act 3, Scene 2 provides us with some of his most impressive lines. Upon the king handing him his intercepted letters, demonstrating his duplicity, he realizes that he's been found out, and we witness an incredible transformation in his fall from grace. He says to himself, "What should this mean? What sudden anger's this? How have I reaped it?" He parted frowning from me as if ruin leaped from his eyes. So looks the chafed lion upon the daring huntsman that has galled him, then makes him nothing. I must read this paper. I fear the story of his anger. 'Tis so. This paper has undone me. 'Tis the account of all that world of wealth I have drawn together for mine own ends, indeed to gain the popedom and fee my friends in Rome. O negligence, fit for a fool to fall by! What cross devil made me put this main secret in the packet I sent the king? Is there no way to cure this? No new device to beat this from his brains? I know 'twill stir him strongly. Yet, I know a way, if it take right, in spite of fortune will bring me off again. What's this? To the Pope? Oh. The letter as I live with all the business I writ to his holiness. Nay then, farewell. I have touched the highest point of all my greatness. And from that full meridian of my glory, I haste now to my setting. I shall fall like a bright exaltation in the evening, and no man see me more. But ironically, once Wolsey resigns himself to his downfall, he seems suddenly at peace, as if a huge weight has been lifted off of his shoulders. Of course, when it comes to Henry VIII the man, the biggest turning point in history is when he decides to break from the Roman Catholic Church and set himself up as the head of the Church of England. We'll explore the devastating consequences of this action, but for now, let's look at some of the correlations between Henry VIII, the play, and some of the other Shakespeare plays. As I just mentioned, the king meets Anne Boleyn for the first time at a mask in Act 1, Scene 4, and it appears to be love at first sight, or perhaps lust at first sight, at least for the king. We also see this happen with the two title lovers in Romeo and Juliet at a mask given by Capulet, and with Edward III and the Countess of Salisbury in Edward III, although that was one-sided and not at a mask. There's also a mask in Love's Labour's Lost, where the King of Navarre and his men dance with the Queen of France and her ladies, while the guys pretend to be visiting Muscovites. And in Much Ado About Nothing, Beatrice uses a mask to insult Benedict, who doesn't reveal who he is to her. At the beginning of the play, we learn that Henry VIII married his late brother's wife, Catherine of Aragon, within a year of his brother's death. At the beginning of Hamlet, we learn that Claudius has married his late brother's wife, Gertrude, within 3 months of his brother's death. In Act 1, Scene 1, Buckingham describes a non-scene in which the kings of England and France meet in great pomp and ceremony, celebrating their joint declarations of peace, which is described in beautiful and majestic glowing terms. In Act 2, Scene 2 of Antony and Cleopatra, we hear Enobarbus describe the iconic unseen meeting of the title characters on Cleopatra's barge in glorious and vivid detail. In Act 4, Scene 2, the always virtuous and chaste Catherine experiences a wonderful dream in which a blessed troupe invites her to a banquet and promises her eternal happiness. In Richard III, the noble Richmond has a most pleasant and glorious dream, promising him victory and success in his battle at Bosworth Field. However, both Clarence and Richard experience terrifying dreams, forecasting them dying and going to hell for their horrific sins and actions. In Act 3, Scene 2, we hear Cardinal Wolsey speak to himself on the topic of sinning, saying, "And when he falls like Lucifer, never to hope again." In the Broadway musical Les Miserables, we hear Inspector Javert sing in a song called Stars, "And when you fall as Lucifer fell, the flame, the sword." Falls from grace are not uncommon in other Shakespeare plays. There's King Lear, Queen Margaret in Henry VI, Part 3, Queen Elizabeth in Richard III, Paralis in All's Well That Ends Well, Falstaff in Henry IV, Part 2, Richard II, Lord Angelo in Measure for Measure, Coriolanus, and Timon of Athens. Henry VIII claims that his wife Catherine of Aragon has been unfaithful to him, even though we know that wasn't true. In Richard III, Richard spreads rumors that his mother was unfaithful to his father, and that Queen Elizabeth was unfaithful to his brother Richard and vice versa, in order for Richard to ascend to the throne. To this day, we still do not know for certain if all the parties in question were legitimate or not. In The Merry Wives of Windsor, Master Ford is jealous of his wife Alice, even though she is chaste and virtuous. In Cymbeline, Posthumus is tricked into believing that his wife Imogen has been unfaithful to him, even though that's false. In The Winter's Tale, Leontes convinces himself that his wife Hermione has been unfaithful to him, even though that was untrue. In Othello, Othello is tricked by the villainous Iago into believing that his wife Desdemona has been unfaithful to him, even though that wasn't true either. And in The Life and Death of King John, the late Sir Robert Falconbridge claimed that his wife had been unfaithful to him, and Lady Falconbridge confesses to her son Philip that Sir Richard Plantagenet, a.k.a. Richard the Lionhearted, was actually in fact his true father. In Act 2, Scene 3, Anne Boleyn and the old lady talk about what they would do in order to become the queen. In Othello, Desdemona and Amelia talk about what they would be willing to do for the world. And in The Merry Wives of Windsor, Mistress Page and Mistress Ford talk about what they would be willing to do in order to become knighted by having an affair with Sir John Falstaff. At the end of Henry VIII, the king orders his council to love one another even though they don't like each other. In Richard II, the king tries to get Thomas Mowbray and Henry Bolingbroke to make up, but he fails to do so and banishes them both. In Henry VI, Parts 2 and 3, the king tries to get his nobles to treat each other with brotherly love, but he also fails, and in Richard III, the dying King Edward IV orders his nobles to love one another even though they don't like each other, and their promises die along with him. There are also a couple of interesting correlations to the Bible in Henry VIII. The first one is in the book of Leviticus, chapter 20, verse 21, which reads, "He that marrieth his brother's wife doth an unlawful thing. He hath uncovered his brother's nakedness. They shall be without children. Henry uses this verse as a reason why Catherine has not borne him a male heir and cites its justification for annulling their marriage. However, I checked with an extremely learned theologian who confirmed that this verse refers to marrying your brother's wife if he is still alive, which would be adultery. In fact, had Rome bothered to reference the Gospel of St. Matthew in chapter 22, verse 24, which reads, saying, Master, Moses said, if a man die having no son, his brother shall marry his wife and raise up issue to his brother, the king might have realized that he was actually in line with Catholic teaching and would not have been able to use this excuse to abandon Catherine. Of course, that doesn't mean that he wouldn't have done it anyway, but he wouldn't have been able to blame the Pope for his refusal to grant the annulment, and perhaps it might have prevented him from brutally punishing English Catholics just because he didn't get his way from the Pope. When we return, we'll look at some interesting facts about Henry VIII. When we talk about Shakespeare's most famous historical characters, Henry VIII ranks right up there with Julius Caesar and Cleopatra. However, we have far more existing historical data about Henry VIII than the other two because he lived within 17 years of Shakespeare's life. In addition, both Caesar and Cleopatra died in the 1st century BC, while Henry VIII died only 478 years ago, meaning that in comparison, we have a lot more accurate information on which to go. Speaking of Henry VIII, the play, it was co-written around 1613 with John Fletcher, with whom Shakespeare had also co-written The Two Noble Kinsmen and the presumably lost Cardenio. In fact, except for The Two Noble Kinsmen, it most likely was Shakespeare's last play. The original title of the play was called All is True, but it was published in the first folio under the title of The Famous History of the Life of Henry VIII, although today it's simply referred to as Henry VIII. There may have been some objections to writing about such a famous person so soon after his death, and indeed, I believe his name is only used once in the play, if that. Other than that, he's simply referred to as the king. One of the most famous stories about the play is that it was only performed at most a handful of times because in one of the earliest performances at the Globe Theatre on June 29, 1613, a cannon was fired as part of the performance during Anne's coronation and burned the whole theatre to the ground in under an hour. Fortunately, there were no fatalities. The performance was witnessed by George Villiers, the contemporary Duke of Buckingham, who was neither related to nor descended from the Duke of Buckingham portrayed in the play. He left the theatre halfway through once the play's Duke of Buckingham was executed. Ironically, just 1 month later, Villiers himself was assassinated. I also wanted to mention that Sir Thomas More lived during the same time as Henry VIII and was in fact martyred by the king. There is a surviving manuscript called Sir Thomas More, which contains many layers of collaborative writings, revisions, and censorships. Scholars of the play think that it was originally written by playwrights Anthony Munday and Henry Chettle, and some years later heavily revised by another team of playwrights including Thomas Heywood, Thomas Dekker, and William Shakespeare. However, it's believed that Shakespeare's actual involvement may have just been corrections to one scene in the entire play. If additional information becomes available in the near future, who knows, I might be back doing an episode on that play. So all of you English blokes, check your attics and let me know if anything interesting turns up. It's uncertain that the play Sir Thomas More was ever performed in Shakespeare's lifetime. In fact, its first known professional staging was not until June 22, 1954 at the London Theatre Centre for the Advanced Players Association. And for those of you keeping score at home, let me just run through how each of the 6 wives of Henry VIII fared. As we know from this play, Catherine of Aragon was the daughter of King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella of Spain, the same pair who financially subsidized Christopher Columbus's voyage to the New World. Henry VIII divorced Catherine after she bore the king their daughter Mary, also known as Bloody Mary. Anne Boleyn was beheaded for alleged infidelities. By the way, in the play, her last name is spelled Bullen. However, since she was educated in the French court, she preferred the more French-sounding spelling Boleyn. Anne was about 2 months pregnant at the time of her coronation, although it's unlikely that the parents were aware of it at the time, and it's not mentioned at all in the play. Jane Seymour, who bore Henry his succeeding son Edward VI, who reigned for only 6 years from the age of 9 to 15, died of postnatal complications 2 weeks after delivering her son. Henry's marriage to the German-born Anne of Cleves was annulled after only 6 months, and she spent the remaining 17 years of her life living in England. Henry was 49 when he married the 17-year-old Catherine Howard, whom he had beheaded 3 months later on charges of adultery with her distant cousin Thomas Culpeper. And finally, Catherine Parr outlived Henry by a year and 8 months, but died of complications during childbirth, and with 4 husbands, she holds the record as the most married English queen. In Act 3, Scene 2, Surrey mentions Cardinal Wolsey having a brown wench in his arms. This refers to Wolsey's mistress, known as Mistress Joan Lark, with whom he fathered at least 2 children, Reverend Thomas Winter, who became Dean of Wells, and Dorothy Clancy, who became a nun. Incidentally, after Wolsey's death, Thomas Winter, who had lived in France, returned to England penniless, but was financially supported by none other than Wolsey's old adversary, Anne Boleyn. Before he met Anne Boleyn, Henry VIII had had an affair with her married older sister Mary. Henry also fathered an illegitimate child by his mistress Elizabeth Bessie Blunt, whose name was Henry Fitzroy, which, by the way, means son of the king. Henry VIII, who was the first king to be addressed by the title Your Majesty, was a talented musician and owned many viols, recorders, lutes, and virginals, which are similar to harpsichords. He was also an animal lover and was particularly fond of dogs, especially greyhounds and beagles. Due to a horse-related accident, Henry injured his leg, ate and drank heavily, and after 40 weighed about 400 pounds. He also had to use a crane in order to be mounted on his horse at that point. When Henry was young, he staunchly supported the Catholic Church, so much so that Pope Leo X gave him the title of Defender of the Faith. That would be, of course, referring to the Catholic faith. Ironically, that title is still held by every English ruler to this day. Henry VIII can never escape his notorious legacy for what he did to the Catholic faith in England. After he created the Church of England and made himself the head of it, he had 81 people executed for heresy and ordered Cromwell to dissolve about 800 Catholic monasteries and religious buildings in England. His daughter Mary tried to restore the country to Catholicism and had about 300 Protestants burned at the stake, hence her nickname Bloody Mary. But Queen Elizabeth I, who reigned after Mary, picked up where Henry had left off, executing 183 people, all or nearly all Catholics who would not abandon their faith. In this book, Mementos of the English Martyrs and Confessors, which was written in 1910, there are accounts of atrocities Catholics experienced under Queen Elizabeth, who was queen in Shakespeare's lifetime. I have to warn you, these accounts are extremely graphic and disturbing, and although this book contains one for every day of the year, here are just 4 quick excerpts of how Catholics were treated under Elizabeth I, despite Cranmer's optimistic prophecy at the end of the play. Venerable William Pattinson, in 1592, the night before his execution, he was put into a condemned hole with 7 malefactors. He converted 6 of the 7, for which his persecutors were so enraged that they caused the martyr to be cut down immediately after hanging so that he was alive and conscious while they cut him open. Venerable William Pikes, in 1591, he was hung and cut down alive, then held down with halberds while he was butchered alive. A halberd is a two-handed pole arm with an axe blade topped with a spike mounted on a long shaft. St. Margaret Clitheroe, in 1586, was crushed to death after a weighted door was laid upon her for a quarter of an hour and piled with rocks. And finally, the Venerable Edmund Jennings. In 1591, this priest was ripped up and his bowels cast into a fire in front of him, while the executioner held his heart in his hand, and with his last words the priest uttered a prayer of mercy to St. Gregory, while the executioner mocked him, saying, "His heart is in my hand, and yet Gregory is in his mouth. Oh, egregious papist!" But if any good came out of this bloodshed, I also read how many young English men during this time begged their higher-ups to send them to France and be allowed to complete their seminary requirements for becoming priests so that they could return to England in hopes of becoming martyred and dying for Christ. They were truly invested in the faith, and men for all seasons. When we return, we'll look at some of the remarkable actors in the 1979 BBC Shakespeare version of Henry VIII. In the Godfather 30th Anniversary DVD collection, director Francis Ford Coppola explained how he took a copy of the novel and wrote notes on every page indicating what had to be captured in each particular scene. I remember him saying that in the scene when Michael Corleone sees Apollonia, a beautiful but humble Italian woman, for the very first time, Coppola wrote a note to himself saying, "Your jaw has to drop when you see her or the scene is ruined." I believe that Kevin Billington, who directed the 1979 BBC Shakespeare version of Henry VIII, probably gave himself a similar stage direction when casting the drop-dead gorgeous Barbara Kellerman to play Anne Boleyn. She doesn't have very many lines in the play, but she has to win over the king and the commoners as soon as they see her because they all love Lady Catherine. But win them over she does, and so the actress was an excellent choice for this role. Julian Glover, who plays the Duke of Buckingham, also played the Constable of France in Henry V in 1979. John Stride, who plays Henry VIII, was a founding member of Laurence Olivier's Old Vic Company. Timothy West, who plays Cardinal Wolsey, was married to Prunella Scales, who played Mistress Page in The Merry Wives of Windsor in 1982. John Rao, who plays Cromwell, also played Lennox in Macbeth in 1983, and the first Roman senator in Coriolanus in 1984. The unseen Tony Church, who recites the prologue, also played Duke Senior in As You Like It in 1978. David Dodemede, who plays the Bishop of Lincoln, also played Lepidus in the Charlton Heston version of Julius Caesar in 1970. John Nettleton, who plays Lord Chamberlain, played Gonzalo in The Tempest in 1979. John Rhys Davies, who plays Caputius, ambassador from Emperor Charles V, played Salario in The Merchant of Venice in 1980. Jeremy Kemp, who played the Duke of Norfolk, also played Leontes in The Winter's Tale in 1981, and was also featured as Captain Jean-Luc Picard's brother Robert on Star Trek The Next Generation in 1990. And finally, the spectacular Claire Bloom gives the performance of a lifetime as Catherine of Aragon. In addition, she also played Gertrude in Hamlet in 1980 and Constance in The Life and Death of King John in 1984. Now stay tuned for today's trivia challenge called Does Your Dog Bite? All right, now it's time for today's trivia challenge called Does Your Dog Bite, as Inspector Clouseau might pronounce it. Identify the Shakespeare plays in which these dogs are mentioned and their respective owners. Number 1, Crab. Number 2, Troilus. And number 3, Tray, Blanche, and Sweetheart. When we return, I'll have the answers for you, and we'll finish up with some relevant lessons from Henry VIII. All right, let's see how you did on today's trivia challenge called Does Your Dog Bite? You are to identify the Shakespeare plays in which these dogs are mentioned and their respective owners. Number 1, Crab. That is Valentine's servant Launce in The Two Gentlemen of Verona. Number 2, Troilus. That is Petruchio's spaniel in The Taming of the Shrew. And 3, Tray, Blanche, and Sweetheart. They are King Lear's dogs in King Lear. Now let's finish up with some relevant lessons from Henry VIII. First, if you work in a political environment, be sure to watch your back. Remember that a lie can travel halfway around the world while the truth is putting on his shoes. And don't forget, a smart enemy hits you exactly where you think you're safe. Second, when someone starts a rumor about you, live your life in such a way that no one will believe it. You can't prevent what people say about you, but you can build up credibility through your integrity and congruency in your words and actions. And finally, always take the high road. To paraphrase George Bernard Shaw, never wrestle with pigs. You get dirty, and besides, the pig likes it. Also, it will be harder for onlookers to tell you apart. So hold your tongue. As Abraham Lincoln once said, it's better to remain silent and be thought the fool than to speak and remove all doubt. I'm Dave Romeo, and thank you for watching this episode of Romeo and Shakespeare. Please join me next time when an English king gives away his throne to 2 selfish daughters and is left all alone.